Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Loren Schoenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Jazz Museum in Harlem. On behalf of Philomena Grant, right over here, our Executive Assistant, myself, Greg Thomas, who's the co-producer of the series, and our Board Chairman, Leonard Garment, and my co-director, Christian McBride. I'd like to welcome you to our office. I'm looking around the room here, and I notice a lot of faces that I know already, and those that I don't know, I hope you become a member of our Jazz Museum family. We're currently looking to build a major jazz museum on 125th Street. We're in the process right now of going about the long work that entails, and that's been a 3-year process. And in the meantime, we're doing these series, and we've been going since the early part of this year. You'll see on the wall behind you, those are all photos from the various Harlem Speaks events, and we're going to be picking up in January once again and continuing all throughout 2005. There's a lot to find out about us, and I'm sure you'll be coming back. All I can say is I think this is probably the last you're going to hear from me this evening, because my guest is someone who I respect in so many different ways. I'm trying to think of if there's one primary way which I respect this guy. Not only is he a superlative musician and a superlative band leader and a superlative educator and a superlative historian, but he's one of those rare people that I've been lucky to encounter in my years in New York as the kind of person who lives, breathes, and his involvement in music and everything is just a 24/7 kind of thing for him. And we're so honored that he came up. He's been up here a few times to our office for informal consultation. And hopefully this is just the beginning of a beautiful thing. I'm very honored to have with us Bobby Sanabria. Thank you very much, Andy. And basically, these things are usually along the lines of an interview. In other words, where I interview someone about their career and the various things that they've done. But when I mentioned this to Mr. Sanabria, it became very clear that what he had in mind to do, which is fine for us, it's less work for me, frankly, I don't have to think about the next question to ask, which is what I'm usually doing when I'm interviewing someone, is just to take it and run with it and do a history of a very particular thing that's very important to him. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll stay as your DJ if you'd like.
Of course.
Okay, you got it.
Thank you so much. How about a big round of applause for Loren Schoenberg? And this soon-to-be great place that's going to be an oasis here in Harlem. As you well know, those of you who are Harlem residents, Harlem has always been a place where transformation occurs. And Harlem has been transforming over the last few years into being the mecca of New York City as it once was many years ago. And the Jazz Museum in Harlem is part of that transformation. So in a few years, you're going to see a beautiful building housing the complete history of America's greatest art form. And when I mean America, in case you weren't paying attention during high school geography, America is not only North America, but Central and South America and the Caribbean. And the greatest contribution that America has made to the world is obviously the jazz tradition. And here in Harlem, well, Harlem has been very important to that history, especially a section known as East Harlem. And that's the topic of tonight, because in East Harlem, a particular genre of music was born that has spawned a sort of revisionist history toward jazz and the importance of the Latino contribution to this incredible American music. So tonight's topic of discussion is East Harlem, birthplace of Afro-Cuban jazz. So before we get into that, nothing is born in a vacuum. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a history of this area known as East Harlem. When we talk about East Harlem, or what is colloquially known to Latinos, Hispanics, as El Barrio, which literally translated means the neighborhood. And we're talking basically about the area from 5th Avenue, from East 96th Street, all the way up to 125th Street. From 5th Avenue, all the way to the river, the East River, all the way up to 125th Street. Although you'll get some people arguing with you, and they'll start saying to you, well, you got to really include all the way up to probably East 140th Street, East 142nd Street. But for residents of this area, it's 96th Street to 125th Street, from 5th Avenue all the way across to the East River. And in this small area a new form of music began to develop. But as I said, nothing is born in a vacuum. So let's talk a little bit about the history of this area. The village of New Harlem was established in 1658 by Dutch governor Peter Stuyvesant on the lands of the Indians, or the Amur Indians that inhabited this area, known as the Wecquaesec. Then, the next inhabitants were the Dutch, English, and African Americans, who first were obviously slaves during the colonial period, and then later were free farmers in this area. These were the first inhabitants, besides the native inhabitants, the Amur Indians, who truly were the first people that lived here. In 1811, New York City started a commission to draw up a grid system to name all of the streets, okay? And at the time, the area was sparsely settled, but the streets started to be named. This was all basically farmland. There was a Harlem Creek over here where you could sail boats. You would go fishing.
I'm just gonna be in my mic, it's a little loud.
Okay. You'd sail boats, you'd go fishing, etc. So, besides the farmers that were here, it was a place for the well-to-do. People from downtown that had money would come up here, sort of as a resort area. Finally, something momentous happened. In 1837, the New York and Harlem Railroad was constructed on what is today known as Park Avenue. And of course, the people that built that railroad were the Germans and Irish, and who they eventually settled in this area. In 1850, the population, by the census, was only 1,500, but there were 4 churches. Churches are very important to any neighborhood because they provide spiritual comfort to the community. They are meeting places. People that are immigrants come to meet each other, help each other out. So the churches in this area are very important through the history of all of the immigrants that have come here. Okay. Finally, in 1870, the 2nd and 3rd Avenue L was constructed, and blocks of tenements were erected to house all of this migration coming in here for the people that were already here, the Dutch, the Germans, the Irish, etc., who were here and constructed the railroad, etc., as I mentioned before. Finally, in the 1890s, the Jewish and Italian communities began to be established. They came from East Europe and, of course, Italy. And amongst the Jewish community, regional associations known as Landmannschaften determined where one would live. Okay, if somebody came from Eastern Europe, these regional associations said, well, you're going to live in this area because there's an apartment there available, et cetera, et cetera. So the Jewish community became very powerful in this area, and the Italian community. The Italian community here in East Harlem became the biggest community in New York City, bigger than in what is known as Little Italy, down in the village area. Finally, in 1898, we have the Spanish-American War. And those of you who know a little bit of history know that the United States declared war on Spain because of the mysterious explosion that happened on the battleship Maine. The Maine had been on a world tour showing America's strength all across the world, etc. And all of a sudden now, in Havana, Cuba, in the harbor there, this great battleship, the symbol of the United States, was blown up. Till this day, nobody knows what really happened. But of course, politicians started blaming Spanish terrorists, people that wanted an independence movement on the island of Cuba, etc. And so we declared war on Spain. Okay? You all know about Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders and all of the legends built around the Spanish-American War, etc. But because of this war, Puerto Rico became a dominion of the United States, a colony. Here in New York City, in East Harlem, in 1898, a club was founded, Dos Antillas. This was a club that was founded here in support of the independence movement for Cuba and Puerto Rico here in New York City, hence Dos Antillas. The Great Antilles are known as Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Dos Antillas, the two Antilles, Cuba and Puerto Rico. And interestingly enough, the treasurer for this organization was the great Arturo Schoenberg, great Puerto Rican, who was responsible for documenting the African diaspora in the New World, and his archives are world famous. And we have the Schoenberg Center here in Harlem for research in black culture. So, now, during this time period, we get, obviously, a migration happening of Puerto Ricanos, and basically they go to southern Brooklyn, the Red Hook area, and here in East Harlem. Something very interesting happens in 1917 to increase this migration. Okay? At first it begins as a little bit of a trickle, and then finally in 1917 something happens. We have the passage by Congress of the Jones Act. Those of you who are students of history, we have a few here, know that the Jones Act granted citizenship to islanders, to Puerto Ricanos. Anybody that was born here from Puerto Rican parents already obtained citizenship, but now the United States Congress grants citizenship to native Puerto Ricans on the island. And due to the job shortages, during this time period, of course, on the island of Puerto Rico, many Puerto Ricans start migrating. What are the job shortages? Well, the industries in Puerto Rico was sugar, tobacco, cigar making, etc. These jobs were not enough to supply the job demand on the island because the population of the island was increasing. So because of this Jones Act in 1917, we get the beginning of this massive migration of Puerto Ricanos starts, and they come here to East Harlem. Okay. Because of the lack of jobs, etc., and the economic, so to speak, depravity that was happening in Puerto Rico, the United States government tried to do some things to stop that, to aid Puerto Rico. And we have the beginning of Operaciones Mano a la Obra, or Operation Bootstrap. This was to provide factory work to islanders, but in a sense, it basically failed. And more Puerto Ricanos start coming here in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Okay. Another act of Congress in 1921, the Johnson Act, limits immigration of Eastern Europeans to the United States. And so this creates work for blacks from down south who start coming here also to New York City, and this new immigration of Puerto Ricanos. So it gives them opportunities for work. So the population of East Harlem starts showing a new identity. Okay? The Dutch that we hear, the Germans that we hear, the Irish that we hear, the Jewish people that we hear, now, like every other migrant group that comes, okay, the Puerto Rican community starts dealing with the issues of finding work, establishing a community here to have their identity, okay, and of course they meet with discrimination and prejudice, as every immigrant group has when they've come here. Okay? But through the efforts of people like Arturo Schoenberg and others, newspapers start springing up here in New York City. We have Puerto Rican-owned newspapers like La Liberación, who promoted the independence movement. El Periódico Gráfico and La Liga Puertorriqueña Hispana, who also had a newspaper. You start getting shops opening up in the area. You start getting Spanish being heard all throughout the area, okay? And I'd like to turn to a quote by a gentleman, Bernardo Vega, who was a cigar maker who migrated to El Barrio. Puertorriqueño. In 1916, when Bernardo Vega, the cigar maker who later wrote his widely read memoirs, arrived here, he recalled that there were about 50 Puerto Rican families living in what later became known as El Barrio. Between the two world wars, this community grew by 1926, and 60% of the Puerto Rican migrant population lived there. The Jewish vendors who sold their wares at the open-air market, later called La Marqueta, reflecting the neighborhood's changing communities, began to sell Caribbean products and foods such as plátanos for this burgeoning community. Though there were other Puerto Rican settlements in the city during the 1920s and 30s, East Harlem became the largest and most important. It was here the emerging Latin popular music scene really took off. In the 1920s, the Hall for Hire at 110th Street and 5th Avenue was rented by political and civic organizations for various affairs. Eventually, the Park Palace, named for its elegant decor, featured Latin music entertainment. Located on the second floor, it was a large hall which held 1,500 people. Downstairs was the Carlton Club, which was later named the Golden Casino. During the 1930s, the Golden Casino often hosted Augusto Cohen's band, a Puerto Rican band leader, who played boleros, guarachas, son, rumba from Cuba, plenas from Puerto Rico, and pasodobles from Spain. In fact, this was what every band at the time included in their repertoire, so they had to be very, very versatile. The Golden Casino would later become the Park Plaza. The building became the focal point of the Latin music scene, so much so that Nora Morales titled the song 110th Street and 5th Avenue in tribute to this great ballroom. And here in this ballroom, ladies and gentlemen, is where what we know as Afro-Cuban jazz was born. But to give you more of a sense of the area, we have some slides here, courtesy of City Law and Elena Martinez. And let's go through some of these slides so that you can get a little bit more of a vibe of what East Harlem was like. The first slide we have here, I still just need a little light so I can read. If you can just put on one of the lights. Thank you.
Maybe the back one.
Yeah,
The other one.
there you go. First slide here we have is Frawley Circle. This is East 110th Street and 5th Avenue, and today it's known as Duke Ellington Circle. This is circa 1900. The border between Black Harlem, what became known as Black Harlem and Spanish Harlem. This border also has Duke Ellington Circle and the Park Palace. The second slide here we have is the Duke Ellington Memorial. This is the first one in New York City dedicated to an African American. First in the country dedicated to Duke Ellington, and the dedication was done in 1997.
I'd like to say that my band played the opening of that statue. They went to Marsalis.
What's the name of your band?
And it was built, Loren Schoenberg, and it was built by Bobby Short. That was
Yes.
Bobby Short's 15 years ago. Pardon me for interrupting that.
No,
That's
not at all, not at all. We're here to share historical information. Okay, now we come to the third slide. And this is the Park Palace. Around circa the 1950s, and the group that's playing is the bass players group. Julio Andino would make a name for himself with Machito and the Afro-Cubans, with Tito Rodriguez, and he would also form his own group, this group that you see here. It was here that the emerging Latin music scene really took off. In the 1920s, the Hall for Hire, as I said before, the Park Palace was rented by political and civic organizations. Eventually, the Park Palace featured Latin music entertainment. We'll get to that in a second. But what you're seeing here is the second floor, which was 1,500 people could fit in this ballroom. Very important to the development of any form of music is a gathering place where you can have large groups of people. Okay? So, the Park Palace was one of these massive ballrooms that could hold over 1,000 people. And oddly enough, later on in the South Bronx would take over as the place for Latin music and for jazz, because the South Bronx
eventually had more massive ballrooms than Manhattan. Ballrooms that could hold over 1,000 people, some even 2,000, and of course theaters. Okay, the next slide. Here we have Augusto Cohen and his band. He's the one with the baton, great Puerto Rican musician that had a very versatile band, as I said before. They could play paso dobles from Spain, Puerto Rican music like plenas. They could play Cuban music and some swing music. Okay. Many people argue and say that Augusto Cohen's band was already doing Afro-Cuban jazz or Latino jazz, but not really. So you have the elements of Afro-Cuban jazz, where you have to have musicians that have a strong, incredibly strong background as jazz improvisers. They have to know the vocabulary of jazz, and that means knowing African American culture, and of course knowing the complexities of Cuban music. These musicians knew the complexities of various forms of Caribbean music, but they weren't really jazz improvisers. This was at the Golden Casino. Now, one of the things I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, is that when you see pictures of bands, right, most of the time you just see people talking about the band in the picture, but they never talk about where the picture was taken. And this picture was taken at the Golden Casino in the mid-1930s. Downstairs of the Golden Casino was the Carlton Club, not the Cotton Club, the Carlton Club, which was later renamed the Golden Casino. Okay? During the 1930s, the Golden Casino often hosted this band as their house band, and the Golden Casino would later become the Park Plaza. Next slide. Here we have Machito, Frank Grillo. His full name was Frank Raúl Gutiérrez Grillo de Ayala, otherwise known as Machito, the vocalist, who in his band, Mario Bauzan, the musical director, his brother-in-law, they would really start the beginnings of what became known as Afro-Cuban jazz. And here you see him dancing. Machito was a great dancer, a great ambassador for the music, and in many of the live radio broadcasts, if anybody is old enough to remember hearing, he was a very eloquent spokesman for the music, both in English and in Spanish. Next slide. Here we have an unsung hero of not only Afro-Cuban music, but Puerto Rican music and many forms of Latin American music. The pianist, great Puerto Rican pianist from Ponce, Puerto Rico, Noro Morales. His brother is the drummer and timbala player, right over there. And the Noro Morales Orchestra was, I would say, a society Latin band. That doesn't mean that they couldn't swing hard, but they played for, hotels downtown and in the community in East Harlem. And Noro Morales was, I guess if you compared him to someone in the jazz world, he was the Oscar Peterson of Latin American music. Incredible, brilliant technique. He was the harbinger of his time period, of the era of the great virtuosic Latin American pianists. In there we can put Maestro Charlie Palmieri, Rene Tuzet, and a few others. But Noro was very much known for his flowery, impeccable technique on the piano. He was an improviser, but he was not a jazz musician, to say. He dabbled at jazz, he hinted at jazz in some of his compositions and in his solos. But in terms of knowing jazz repertoire and being able to play the blues and all of the things that are prerequisites for knowledge in terms of complete knowledge of jazz, Noro hinted at it. But he was a tremendous improviser, and his brother Umberto on the drums eventually became a band leader himself. And for those of you who are percussionists, drummers, Umberto Morales, the timbalas that he endorsed for the Lidi Drum Company are sort of looked at as these like really Rosetta stones as far as the instrument that we know today as the timbalas are concerned. Why are they so treasured by percussionists? Well, because they were made from brass, the brass that's used to make trumpets. and trombones. So they had a bell-like tone to them, and they basically were the tools of the masters of the day. Drummers like Orlando Marin, Maestro Tito Puente, and all of the great recordings featured that featured the great timbala solos of the day. They were recorded with these leading timbalas. Humberto Morales eventually became his name was printed on the side of the drums. He wrote a book, an early book on Latin American rhythms, how to play them, etc. It's a collector's item today. It's been reprinted. But as you can tell, this was a big band. It wasn't a full big band. A full big band is 5 saxophones, 4 trumpets, and 4 trombones, or 3 trombones. Of course, that can be adjusted. You can have 4 saxophones, sometimes even just 3 saxophones. But you have to have a complement of saxophones, trumpets, and trombones. And as you can see, we only have a complement of 5 saxophones. They doubled on clarinets. Some of them doubled on flutes. Sometimes in this band, Essie, Morales, Humberto's, and Noro's brother would play flute. He was a virtuosic flute player. There's a book out that Essie Morales wrote on Latin American style flute playing. Really, it's Cuban style flute playing, how to get your high register up there. And the Morales family is very famous in Puerto Rico and throughout Latin America because all of them were great musicians. Okay, we can go to the next line. Here we have two of the virtuosic pianists. In terms of the virtuosity that I'm talking about, impeccable technique, etc. Noro Morales fits the bill, and of course the gentleman on the right with the beard, the gray beard, Charlie Palmieri, who was born and raised in East Harlem. Later on, the family would move to the South Bronx, where Eddie Palmieri was born, and would make a name for himself. Eddie himself has stated that technically his brother was far above him in terms of training, technique, interpretation, and knowledge of various variety of styles. Charlie did know how to play jazz. By that he could play the blues, he could hang with and play jazz tunes or vehicles that jazz musicians used as jazz tunes. He understood jazz harmony completely, but he always was called upon for his virtuosity and his versatility in the world of Latin American music. Charlie played Brazilian music in Fernando Alvarez's band at the Copacabana, along with Tito Puente being the drummer in that band. Charlie knew the tradition of Puerto Rican music, in the danza, the contradanza. He knew the traditions of Cuban music, the danzón, etc. So he was a very, very versatile player. I am speaking about him a lot because his brother obviously became more famous, but Charlie is somebody that any student of the music should really, really check out. And he also, because he got tired of playing on pianos that were out of tune, he started bringing an organ to the gigs. So he was one of the first to record on organ Afro-Cuban based music, as well as a gentleman by the name of Frank Anderson from Panama, who's a little known pianist but a virtuoso in our scene and is still alive today. Charlie unfortunately isn't alive. He was a great band leader. You should check out his recordings. And of course Eddie, what can I say about Eddie? He's a 7-time Grammy winner or 6-time Grammy winner. I'm sure somebody will correct me later on. But the main thing is that he is a Grammy winner, and he was the first to win the Grammy when a new category was established specifically for Latin American music in the Grammys. And that was through the efforts of another pianist, Mr. Larry Harlow, who's of Jewish descent and has a lot to do with the Afro-Cuban music tradition. This is the Park Palace today at 110th Street and 5th Avenue. It's a Mossack Christian church. Many of these ballrooms and theaters, etc., have been taken where Latin music was featured. And by Latin music, and I don't mean Cuban music, I mean all forms of Latin American music, tango, etc., have been taken over by Pentecostal churches. And of course, these Pentecostals will gladly tell you, yes, in these halls, the devil once lived. But we now have brought God to these hallowed halls, so, you know. Okay? This is another place.
It's the same place.
It's the same, well, it's actually the same place, yeah. And here we have the Audubon Ballroom. This is Louis Varona, who's a vocalist. And this band actually was called Louis Varona and the Second Afro-Cubans. Okay? Louis Varona and Marcelino Guerra sort of co-led this group, and Marcelino Guerra, who was another vocalist, eventually took it over. And Marcelino Guerra's association with Machito and the Afro-Cubans goes way back. He was the one that sang Segunda Voz, sang second voice, the choruses on many of the albums with Graciela. But why was this called the Second Afro-Cubans? Well, because Machito's group was so popular that they couldn't keep up with all of the bookings that they had. So they formed another group. Marcelino Guerra and Louis Varona would front it, and of course Machito and Mario Balza would get their little taste on the side, you know, for their percentage. And of course what did they do as in the repertoire? They did all of the music of the Machito Afro-Cubans. Okay? Now the drummer for this group was a gentleman by the name of Steve Barrios, and his son later on, Steve Barrios Jr., would become the drummer for Fort Apache, for Jerry Gonzalez and the Fort Apache band. The drum set. All of the drummers in this era that played Latin music had to be able to function on the drum set and on the timbales. Why would they use the drum set? Well, because these bands played swing music for dancers. If somebody requested a swing number, they would play it. If somebody requested an Argentinian tango, they would play it. If somebody requested a cumbia from Colombia, well, they would play it. If they didn't have it in their books, they'd improvise it. Okay? So they weren't only required to play rhythms that necessarily are from the Afro-Cuban canon. They would play rhythms from all of Latin America, and of course, swing rhythms also. That started to change in the late 1940s in the hotel scene in New York City, because the Musicians Union feared the versatility of Latin American musicians. They could play basically any tempos, any styles of music. What happened was the Musicians Union, especially in the hotel gigs, started having the main band made up of Anglo-American musicians, and then you'd have the relief band, which would basically be the band made up of Latin American musicians. So this is when the drummers, they didn't have to bring the full complement of the drum set anymore to gigs, because you'd have the main band playing swing rhythms, etc., popular, music of the day that didn't utilize Latin American rhythms, and you'd have the Latin band. And of course, the relief band, the Latin band, would get paid less money. But that's another story. We can talk about, of course, the improprieties as far as musicians getting paid, African American musicians and Latin American musicians. So this was the thing that the Musicians Union did, that they said, well, you have to have two bands. You can't just have one band playing all the styles, because they feared the versatility of Latin American musicians. Doesn't mean that Latin American musicians were technically better or anything like that. It just, Latin American musicians came from Latin America, and they listened to American music, popular American music, as well as the music that they grew up listening to from their native countries. So they just were very versatile, like someone who grows up in a household speaking Spanish and English. By the very fact that they can speak two languages just makes them a little bit more versatile. And sometimes that versatility can be a detriment to you in the discrimination of the day, both racially, culturally, and of course musically. Next slide. Here we have what became known as the Metropolis Studios. This is on 1443 Park Avenue at 106th Street. It later became the Odd Fellows Hall, and the Odd Fellows Hall, this building, had a space that was rented out for dances, and later on, recording companies would use this hall to, because of the acoustics, to record bands. And one of the bands that recorded there was Machito and the Afro-Cubans, and this is where they recorded the album Kenya, which featured J.J. Johnson and Cannonball Adderley, amongst others, and Herbie Mann. It's an incredible album. I have it here. We can probably play an excerpt from it a little bit later. But all of you who are interested in this music, and obviously you are interested because you here should have that album. It's an incredible album. It's called Kenya. What's great about that album, as I said, is that there are many players on it who later would become very famous, amongst them Cannonball Adderley, who was featured as a soloist on that album. The next slide. This is one of my favorite slides. This is Casa Latina in the early 1950s. The original location of this famous record store here in East Harlem was at 110th Street near Park Avenue. Then later on it moved to 116th Street and Lexington Avenue. The owner is this gentleman holding the record with the black suit. That's Bartolo Alvarez, the original owner. Okay. And this is a picture of the Casa Latina in its original location. In 1948, he bought the store and renamed it Casa Latina. In 1969, it was bought by Alfonso Rubio, and now it's run by his daughter and son-in-law. It is the longest running music store in the East Harlem community. I have to say this, record stores for any community are very important. Why? Because they are your tie to your past and your present, and obviously the future of the music that you are listening to, okay? And also, it's a gathering place. A record store is a gathering place for musicians. Hey, somebody might need a saxophonist or a trumpeter. And the record store owner usually had a tie to the community where he knew all of the phone numbers of all of the musicians. It's a meeting place also where people from the community can meet their musical heroes. Okay? You might walk in, and who might you see there? You might see Machito, or you might see Augusto Cohen, or you might see Tito Puente, and you get to strike up a conversation, and you say, hey, well, are you recording something new? And you get the scoop or the dope of what's happening on the scene, etc. So here at the store was, besides recordings, piano rolls were sold, guitars were sold. In the back of the store, you might have musicians, working on, say like somebody who's a writer. He has his guitar, and another band leader is there, and he goes, "Hey, you got any new songs? Yeah, sure. Listen to this." Boom, And of course, they strike up a conversation. A deal is made, and maybe that could be the next hit record for a band leader. Okay. So record stores are very important to the development of any community, especially the Latino community. The history of this record store, it goes even farther back than Bartolo Alvarez. This used to be known as the Spanish Music Center, and it was owned in 1934 by a Puerto Rican by the name of Gabriel Oyer. Okay? He sold recordings. In the back of the store, he had a little small makeshift studio, and he recorded the music of neighborhood trios and cuartetos for the Dynasonic label. This was the first Puerto Rican-owned recording company in New York City. So the history of the store even goes further back. When Bartolo Alvarez took it over, he moved the store to 110th Street and Fifth and Park, and the store sold musical instruments. Bartolo founded Alba, which was a record company where Charlie Palmieri first recorded as a band leader with the band. Carlos Palmieri y su conjunto, he also recorded. And later they founded Rival Records. which recorded some of the most popular artists at the time, including the Puerto Rican singer by the name of Davilita. Ironically, Mr. Alvarez was inspired to become a musician at the age of 14. When he started, he stopped by the Almacenes Hernandez, which was owned by the Familia Hernandez, Victoria Hernandez and Rafael Hernandez, and he first listened to Rafael Hernandez, Puerto Rico's greatest composer. He heard him play there, and he sort of said to himself, "Oh, forget it. I'm not going to be a musician. These people are real musicians." Okay? So here we go now to the next slide, and this is what Casa Valentina looks like basically today. It's on 116th and Lexington Avenue. I encourage all of you to go to these places, and if they still exist or don't exist, just go there to get the vibe, because you will feel the spirits of our ancient ancestors in these areas. And here we have Rafael and Victoria Hernandez. What can be said about them? Well, Victoria and Rafael Hernandez migrated to New York City and were to become key players in the burgeoning Latin music scene. Born in Aguadilla to poor Afro-Puerto Rican tobacco workers, Rafael, Victoria, and their brother Jesus all became accomplished musicians. Rafael became part of James Reese Europe's 369th Infantry Hellfighters military band, the famous African-American regimental band that toured throughout Europe and is credited with introducing jazz to European audiences. Rafael was a trumpet player in that band. Interesting story about the Hellfighters band. Part of the FDR Drive is named after them. If you're driving way up and you come downtown from, come crossing the Triborough Bridge and you cross, you'll see a sign, 369th Regiment Hellfighters Band. That's the name of the highway in that area. This band was led by an African American, James Reese Europe, who was in the military at the time, and he was told, form a band of black musicians. He couldn't get well-trained African American musicians, and that's not a disparaging comment to African American musicians, just because a lot of training wasn't available to them at the time because of discrimination. But somebody told him, hey, listen, if you go to Puerto Rico, they have well-trained black musicians down there. Puerto Rico has a history of, and Cuba and the Dominican Republic has a history of training musicians of color in the classical European tradition. So he needed musicians that could read music, sight read music, and interpret other different styles. So he gets about 18 Puerto Rican musicians to be part of this band, and Rafael Hernandez is one of them. This is another example of the ongoing tradition of African Americans and Latino musicians coming together and meeting and exchanging and helping one another. Okay? You can get these recordings. The James Reese Europe band made about 23 recordings, 24 recordings, and you can get them on CD now. So I encourage all of you who are into the history, and obviously you are, to listen to these recordings, and you will hear Rafael Hernandez playing trumpet in this section of this band. Now, Rafael Hernandez in his diaries, very interesting, talks about the discrimination he went through when he came to the United States, imposed on him by his African American brothers, because they spoke Spanish. These Afro-Puerto Rican musicians, the African American musicians sort of treated them with disdain. And why would that be, ladies and gentlemen? Well, it's a simple reason. In those days, discrimination was very weird here in New York City and across the United States. If you were a person of color and you spoke French or Spanish, you were not considered black. I could be the blackest person, and I go into a restaurant in New York, and the person tells me, and those days tells me, you have to get out of here. We don't serve black people or colored people or whatever terms they use in those days, Negro. And if the person all of a sudden started going, hey, excuse me, but I am Cuban. I do not understand what you say. Oh, sit down. This caused this caused friction amongst African Americans and Afro-Cubans, Afro-Puerto Ricans in those days. Many African American musicians would fake and make believe that they were Cuban. Or some even made believe that they were Arabs and Muslims, because if you were Arab or Muslim, you were not considered black either. Babs Gonzalez is one of the biggest examples of that, and there are many, many others. So it just goes to show you how discrimination has always been used, ladies and gentlemen, to separate us as a people, because we have a common ancestry, and that ancestry all goes all the way back to Africa. Because the same music that makes me shake what my mama gave me is the same music that makes everyone else. So we're united by the music, but because of racism and prejudice and that divide and conquer mentality that we've always had in this country to a certain extent, they separate us. And when people are separated, they have no power and they have no strength. And now we're coming into a new age, the 21st century, where we can discuss all of these things, put them on the table and get rid of them and move on forward with the greatness of our common unity through our commonalities. We really don't have many differences. We have more things in common. And these things in common were things that were very much addressed by the Hispanic community, particularly the Puerto Rican community in East Harlem. Because we had to not only fight the prejudices in our own families, because all of us, anybody here who's Cuban or Puerto Rican or Dominican knows, or Trinidadian or whatever knows, that there's always somebody lighter or darker in the family than the others. And then we had to fight those prejudices amongst ourselves here head on with the discrimination of in the United States, especially in New York City, which was so territorial. I'm sure this gentleman right here, who's a senior citizen, can tell you, well, if you walked right over on this block, you get your butt kicked because you weren't supposed to be in this part of the neighborhood. I can attest to that because when I grew up in the Melrose Projects, in the South Bronx on East 153rd Street, if you walk 2 blocks down to Morris Avenue, which was the Italian neighborhood, as soon as you got to the corner, hey man, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in the projects. You're in the wrong neighborhood, son. Etc. And I won't get into the profanities used to describe my ethnic group, which is Puerto Rican, but you can imagine. So imagine all of the prejudices that Rafael Hernandez had to go through. And the weird kind of psychological racism and discrimination that, that our ancestors had to go through in this area,
Some of us in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Huh?
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Latino Crack.
Uh-huh.
We had to go through the same thing.
Sure.
Amongst the blacks.
Sure.
There's color.
Sure.
Because we had a club called, I can't remember, but anyhow, Lena Horne's husband belonged to this club, Tawana. And all the ladies were light skinned, all the men were black. She couldn't join it because she wasn't light enough, but she could sing good. Ruby Ellington and Count Basie played there. But all the women had to be very, very light skinned. Oh, the color was white. But also, as a performer, into anything, if you weren't light skinned, forget it. And I went to a lot of changes.
Sure.
On my skin and brown skin.
Sure. Well, let's move on. Okay. Here we have Machito Square on East 111th Street and 3rd Avenue, named after Frank Grillo, the great vocalist who came from Cuba, and with his brother-in-law, Mario Balsal, would form this incredible orchestra which would change the course of the music in the 20th century. And we're going to close up with our slides here. That's our last slide. So let's talk a little bit about Machito and the Afro-Cubans. Well, let's talk. You have to talk about Mario Balsal. Mario Balsal was a Cuban. Came here. He was trained as a classical musician. He was raised by his Arturo Andrades, his adopted father, because his father was a tabaquero. He worked in, making cigars, etc. And he also was a scout for Cuban baseball teams. So he was traveling all through the island. So his next door neighbor, Arturo Andrades, sort of took him on and raised him. Now Mario was black, Afro-Cuban, and Arturo Andrades was white from Spain. And the one thing that Mario told me that he learned from this gentleman was that he said, Mario, if you are an educated person and you know who you are, no one can mess with you. And that stuck with him. So Mario was always very proud of his African roots. And you're talking about a person growing up in Havana, in the neighborhood of Pogolotti, listening to the drums in the neighborhoods, rumba, guaguancó, yambú, rumba Colombia, this new world music that from African descent in the fusion of Spanish flamenco vocalese with drumming and voice and dance. Then he's trained as a clarinetist. He's learning the European classical tradition, classical technique, and he's learning about the Cuban classical tradition known as danzón. He was a child prodigy, etc. As a teenager, he's working with the burgeoning Havana Philharmonic. And then he works with Antonio Maria Romeo, a pianist, Cuban pianist, very famous, who was responsible for having the first charanga orchestra, the first Cuban orchestra with strings and Baroque flute playing the elegant Cuban danzón. And he gets the opportunity of a lifetime. He comes to New York City as a young 16-year-old man with this band to record for the RCA label. Many bands from Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean were flown into New York City to record at the studios of RCA and then flown back. They didn't perform here, but they recorded here. So during the time period that Mario was here for a couple of weeks, he gets to go see Paul Whiteman and his great orchestra, who had just been, Paul Whiteman commissioned the Gershwins to write Rhapsody in Blue, the first fusion of European classical elements with African American music. And let's listen to Mario talk about his experience here.
My name Frankie Trombao. I never had nothing like that in my life. So I said, it's me. I got to play saxophone. So I bought a saxophone and took a saxophone back to Cuba with me. And when I came back to America and 30 to leave, I was a saxophone player. And then, you can stop right there. Was a fellow singer very popular in Spain by name Antonio Machín. Both the vocalists were Don Aspiazo, the orchestra that came to America to introduce the Cuban music and the big band. So Machín had a quartet outside the Aspiazo band that he recorded for Victor too. So when Aspiazo band returned to Cuba, the trumpet player that recorded with Machín go with his band. So Machín don't have no trumpet to recording with. So he said, what am I going to do now? I get no recording because the quartet, because the trumpet, the main thing is only one trumpet and two guitars and a vocalist. So I said to him, I said, well, I think I can make that. So he said, you don't play trumpet. I said, I don't play trumpet now, but if you buy me one, I'll play. I said, I'm sure. I said, well, you ain't got nothing to lose. Just buy a cheap one. We went to the pawn shop, $15, and I start getting ambush. I said, we got a 15 days to record it. I said, don't worry about it, we're going to record it. And we did record it in 15 days. And after that, I didn't want to play saxophone. I gave my saxophone player to the guy that came from Cuba. I said, take him home. I don't want to play saxophone. I'm going to be a trumpet player. I'm Louis Armstrong crazy. So I started copying all Louis Armstrong solos and everything. And I went haywire with my trumpets.
How about that? So he goes with the Louis Armstrong. He gets inspired by this happenstance thing.
Antonio Machín needs a trumpet player to record. Why? Now he goes. Now there were many trumpet players in New York City, but Machín, the singer, why did he freak out? Because there wasn't anybody in New York City at the time that really know how to play in the vocabulary of a Cuban-style trumpet player. All music, ladies and gentlemen, what makes different styles of music different is the vocabulary and the syntax, how you use that vocabulary. An A flat is an A flat in any style of music. But how do you use that A flat in bebop, or in hard bop, or in the European classical tradition? And then if you're getting into that, forget it, what period? The Romantic period, the Renaissance period, what, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why Antonio Machín freaked out, and when Mario told him, well, buy me a trumpet, man. I'm Cuban, I know the style and everything. And for this man to learn how to play trumpet in 2 weeks, after he'd been playing clarinet and saxophone, amazing. You can get these recordings if you want to listen to them. They're available now. We live in the digital world now. Everything's available. So if you want to get the recordings of Mario Balzan first playing trumpet with Antonio Machín, you can go to descarga.com, descarga.com, and order them. As for the Cuarteto Machín featuring Mario Balzan, amazing, amazing. And then he finally goes on in 1933 to play with the swingingest drummer in the world at the time, the predecessor of Buddy Rich. If you want to know where Buddy Rich came from, the great virtuoso of Jewish descent who grew up in Brooklyn and used to come to Harlem all the time as a little kid, and he was basically the only white guy in the jazz world that blacks loved and respected, because he didn't care. He used to take the train from Brooklyn, come up here and hang out with everybody. Everybody knew him in Harlem as B. Everybody respected him. Everybody loved him. And want to know where Buddy Rich came from? You got to start with Chick Webb. And Mario Balzan gets the opportunity of a lifetime to audition for Chick Webb, who had the swinginest band at the time, and let him speak on that right now.
Excuse me, can you repeat that website?
And I got the first opportunity with a second-rate jazz orchestra, they call it the Missourians, and the famous Savoy Ballroom. I stayed with them about 3 months or something like that. And Big Chick Webb was one of the biggest swing band of in the era, in the 30s. So he listened to me every night. So his trumpet player leaving to take a chair with Duke Ellington. So he told me if I want to try out for the job, I try out for the job. So he said, you come to work tomorrow. So I feel happy. I said, I don't think I can, I ain't the man you're looking for. So he said, well, let me give it to you straight. I got what you need, and you have what I need. I said, what you mean by that? I said, well, music is an international language. You don't speak English like I do, but I understand what you say. That's the same thing you do with my music. I got to teach you how to phrase in my music. You read well, you got a good intonation, good interpretation, but you phrase it get too Latin at times. By that time, I've been hanging around this for boys. By that time, we're going to do this.
Okay. So then he takes the audition because he had what Chick Webb needed, and Chick Webb had what he needed. It wasn't that there weren't any great African-American trumpet players at the time. It's just that it was very rare to find a good lead player. Now, if you want to know, ladies and gentlemen, what's the secret to having a good big band, you have to start with the lead trumpet player. That is the person that is responsible for the phrasing of the orchestra, the identity of the orchestra. He's the person that has the most technical demands put upon them as a player in the orchestra. That's why when many jazz big bands, you don't see the lead trumpet player take solos hardly, because they have to play so much in the upper register all night. It's an endurance thing. You have to play in tune. You have to have a brilliant sound. You have to know the different styles, the different idioms, etc. It's a very demanding position for any trumpet player in any big band. Of course, we have some people that are phenomenal soloists and lead players. That's very rare. John Faddis, Maynard Ferguson, and many others. It's very rare to find people like that. Arturo Sandoval. Now Mario's put in this position, a Cuban, okay? He's barely like 20 years old, and all of a sudden he's put into the position with the swinginest band in New York, and he's made the lead trumpet player. Not only does Chick Webb make him the lead trumpet player, but he makes him the musical director. That means he's responsible for tuning up the band, telling the band where the gigs are, sometimes picking out the material, etc. Amazing, right? Just a testimony to this man's greatness as a musician. So from 1933 to 1938, not only does Mario play with the Chick Webb Orchestra and record Stompin' at the Savoy and a Tisket a Task and all that, and on Stompin' at the Savoy, if you listen to the original version with the Chick Webb band, Mario takes a trumpet solo and then he takes a clarinet solo on the recording.
Do you know how
That
long-
clarinet solo, the first recording of Stompin' at the Savoy with Chick Webb, listen to it. Mario takes a trumpet solo and a clarinet solo.
You know how long you've been playing trumpet when you auditioned? With Chick?
Oh, he had only been playing for like 2 years, 2 or 3 years. 2 or 3 years, amazing. This is a man that knew nothing really about African American culture until he came to New York. He got to know African American culture so well, Mario told me that when he went back to Cuba to visit for the first time, and he gets to the, where, you know, they check you for passports and everything. The guy, he starts walking by the guy, and the guy starts going, you know, hey, wait, you know. He goes, what do you know? He checks his papers, and you're not Cuban. And he goes, what do you mean I'm not Cuban? He goes, you're not Cuban, you're African American, you're black, you know, I could tell the way you talk. And then until Mario started going, you know, finally Mario had to, oye chico, déjame quieto, man, yo soy cubano también, déjame pasar, coño. When he finally starts talking, he goes, oh, I'm sorry. This was a common thing amongst Latinos in New York City. It's a common thing, you see it today. You might see somebody that's Puerto Rican, and they speak like an African American, because they have absorbed African American culture, okay? You're seeing it today with Mexican kids, Colombian kids, any kids coming from all different parts of the world, because what drives American popular music is African American culture. I don't care if it's Britney Spears, AC/DC, Aerosmith, or whatever.
Beatles?
That's what the Beatles, everything. The element that of black culture that is prevalent in all of these forms of music is something of the blues in the music. When you see Celine Dion singing and bending those notes and all that, it all comes from the blues. Okay, people don't know that. Okay, but that's why you know when you see somebody from New York City, like when I went to college for the first time in Boston at the Berklee College of Music, and my roommate's going to me, man, what are you, man? I go, what do you mean? Well, you speak Spanish. I go, yeah. But you talk like a black guy, man. I go, yeah. What are you? I said, well, you know, I'm a New Yorican, man. He goes, what the hell is that? I go, well, it's a Puerto Rican guy that grows up in New York City, that has a Jewish sense of humor, loves Cuban music, and loves black music. And he's looking at me like, cool, you know? You dig? And this was the type of environment that Mario bred with Mario's identity. Okay, and finally, during this time period from 1933 to 1938, not only does he record with the Chick Webb Orchestra, and he records with Fletcher Henderson, Noble Sissle, because of his prowess on the trumpet. Okay? He's offered a job with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, but he turns it down because he says, it's not the style of music that I like. I wouldn't fit in that band. He liked a very powerful hard drum because he was working with Chick Webb, man. So finally, from an argument with Chick Webb over a raise that he had gotten, and many of the musicians being jealous of him and everything, being the Cuban, leading the trumpet section and being the musical director, he leaves the band and he goes with the Cab Calloway Orchestra. Now the Cab Calloway Orchestra, what was great about that orchestra is his payroll along with Duke Ellington's, they had the highest payroll. That was the primo gig if you were a musician of color at that time. Again, you were treated the best, etc. Okay? And what happens, he brings Dizzy Gillespie to the band. And Dizzy talks about how Mario recommended him to the band. Mario used to love baseball, so whenever he could, on the Sunday matinees, he'd go see the Yankee game or go to Brooklyn and see a Dodger or Giant game or whatever. So he'd send somebody as a sub. So he sends Dizzy one afternoon, tells Dizzy, just be cool, take the solos, don't go nuts, you know, behave yourself. And Cab Calloway goes, hey, that kid's pretty good. Mario is very prophetic. He says to him, you don't know what this guy can do. He's going to change the way jazz is played. And okay, Cab Calloway goes, fine, then he's your roommate. You got to take care of him. And this is when Dizzy becomes enamored with Afro-Cuban music, etc. And then something prophetic happens, because we don't have much time. And I know you have some questions. Mario plays some authentic Cuban music for some of the guys in the band. Son, Cuban son, which is with the mandolin, the tres, the mandolin instrument of Cuba, the tres, the guitar, bongo, maracas, etc. Now you can imagine these African American musicians who are super hip, etc., being treated so well, and they're the hippest musicians in the world at the time. All of a sudden they listen to this music that sounds so foreign to them. Plus it's in Spanish. So the first thing they say is, man, Mario, I don't know, man, but that sounds like hillbilly country music. He goes, oh yeah? Well, one day there's going to be a band. One day he gets insulted. He says, well, one day there's going to be a band that's going to be just as hip as the Cab Calloway band, Duke Ellington's band, and it's going to be using these rhythms. And then you're going to freak out. And then we have the beginning of the Machito Afro-Cubans in 1939 with his brother-in-law Frank Machito Grillo, vocalist, moves to New York, starts working with various orchestras, Anselmo Sacasa's band, etc. And then he tells Mario, hey, we should form our own band. He goes, yeah, I know, he gets fired from the Cab Calloway band. The folklore behind that story of him getting fired, supposedly Dizzy Gillespie threw a spitball at Cab Calloway. That's how Dizzy got fired. And Mario got fired because Cab Calloway tells him, you're supposed to be playing a mute in this one section of the tune. And Mario told him, no, I'm not going to do it because anybody knows anything about trumpets, sometimes when you put the mutes in, it's hard to control the intonation, playing in tune. So Mario, being the experienced person that he is, tells Cab Calloway, no, I'm not going to do it because of this, and it's not going to work. And Cab was sort of like not having a good day that day, and he tells Mario, screw you, and he tells him, F you. So Mario said to him, nobody talks to me that way. Packs up his trumpet, and he walks out. Forms the band with his brother-in-law, Frank Grillo, and they begin to play at this place, the Jewish Catering Hall that we talked about before, the Park Palace Ballroom. Now, the relationship between Jews, African Americans, and Latinos, especially Puerto Ricans, has always been a fruitful one, has always been a good one. We inherited their sense of humor, etc. And they were the only ones that would allow us to perform in their venues. Why? They loved our music. They loved our culture. We have many common things. We are very strong in family. Jewish people have always been oppressed. Been oppressed. They understand the whole immigrant thing. They understand the rhythms because they have roots in the Middle East and North Africa, etc., etc. So this Jewish Catering Hall is the first time you hear Latin music in New York City with this great band, the Machito Afro-Cubans. By 1943, this concept that Mario had of combining really lush, complex arrangements that he had learned and experienced firsthand. No other Latino musician had experienced that. You have to understand, no other Latino musician had experienced that. Louis King Garcia played with Benny Goodman, etc. There were others. Juan Tizol played trombone with Duke Ellington and Harry James. But you're talking about Mario Bazar working from 1933 to 1939 with the premier black orchestras of the day, experiencing racism down south, experiencing racism in New York City, working as the lead trumpet player with these great orchestras, with these great band leaders, with these great arrangers, incredible arrangers like Fletcher Henderson. Nobody had that experience, so he brought that to this band that he formed with his brother-in-law. Why didn't he front the band? Because it was a gift to Machito. They had known each other as boyhood friends growing up in Pogolote, Cuba. And Mario fell in love with Machito's sister, Estela. They got married. etc. And he said, Macho, I'll take care of hiring the musicians, running the band. You just be the front guy. So the secret behind the sound was Mario Bauza. And finally, in 1943, they record a song called Tanga. Now this is ground zero as far as Afro-Cuban jazz. Many jazz historians say that Dizzy Gillespie did it with Manteca, with his collaborations with the great Cuban conga drummer Chano Pozo. But even Dizzy Gillespie said, I didn't do it first. Mario was the only one that knew African-American music and Afro-Cuban music equally as well. He was the first one to do it. Dizzy was the first person outside of the sphere of being a Latino that embraced the music, fell in love with it, and said, wow, this is a way for me to connect with my long-lost African roots. And that's why he went to Mario Bauza, and he said, I want one of those guys that plays hand drums in the band. So he tried using a bongo player first, Alejandro Rodriguez. And Alejandro Rodriguez, when he played in Dizzy Gillespie's band, he did one gig with them at Town Hall, and he said, man, I don't understand this. This doesn't fit, with the swing rhythm. What am I doing here? He felt uncomfortable, so he left the band. So Dizzy goes back to Mario and says, listen, what about one of those guys that plays one of those Cuban tom-toms? He goes, I got the man for you. He just arrived from Cuba, Luciano Chano Pozo, and the rest is history. But the first Afro-Cuban and jazz marriage happened with this incredible composition called Tanga. And I would say, ladies and gentlemen, that it also represents the first use of Impressionism in jazz, along with Duke Ellington's work. When you listen to this, imagine imagine all of these things coming together. West Africa, African-American culture, the virtuosity of the jazz improviser, all of these different languages coming together. It could only have happened in one place, ladies and gentlemen, right here in East Harlem. So let's listen to a little bit of Tanga, and then I'll give you a taste of what the orchestra sounded like on video. Nope, not that. Whoa. Got it?
Bailando la tanga,
went completely avant-garde for its time. You can imagine it's 1943. First of all, people didn't even know what a conga drum was really, or a set of bongos, a set of timbales. You couldn't go to a music store and buy anything like that. The only place you could go to was on 116th and Lexington, also, by near Casa Latina. Well, before Casa Latina was recently in that. The only place where you could buy like hand drums at that time, congas and bongos, was at a bakery known as Simon's, which was run by a Cuban baker, and he had a couple of conga drums in the window, and he made them, and he also imported them right from Cuba. He made them only if you knew how to play. You come in, he goes, I want to get one of your congas. He goes, okay, sit down and play me a basic tumbao, a basic rhythm. And if you couldn't play, he goes, get the hell out of here, man, you're wasting my time. If you could play, the way he made them was, you took a piece of paper, you put your hands, both hands on a piece of paper, he traced the outline of your hands, and he made the size of the drum custom made to your hands. Because in those days, the conga drummers only used one drum. And Candido would come in 1946, in June of 1946, and he was the first conga drummer to actually develop the technique to play two drums. But in those days, you only use one conga. And if you hear the conga rhythm on there, congas are going, they're using two guys. Carlos Vidal and Luis Miranda. One guy's going, the other guy's, two guys. Also, if you notice, you're listening to Jose Mangual, who's playing bongos on that. He's playing the side of the bongos with a stick, which is a technique we don't use anymore. And Obaldo Nieto's on the timbales playing riding on the cabo. You hear this wood sound, that's Jose Mangual Buyu Sr. hitting the side of the bongos. It's a technique that's not used anymore. The last guys that I ever saw use that technique was Joe Gonzalez with, what's his name? ¿Cómo se llama él? El conguero that died. They used to have a song group here. Armando Sanchez group. Armando Sanchez was into that old school thing. He would tell Joe, hey, play the side of the bongos in the Montuno section, with the stick. Nobody uses that anymore.
Is that the same as baqueteo?
No. Baqueteo is when you play on the top of the timbales and you strike them, creating the sound like of a hand drum for danzón. That's what baqueteo is.
But who's
So anyway, that's the beginning of Afro-Cuban jazz, ladies and gentlemen. I don't care what anybody says. I don't care what jazz books you read, whatever the hell, because what happens is in our world, in the world of Latinos, many times we're not credited with our innovations and our contributions because people think that, oh, well, they could never have done that. How could they have done that? They're not as sophisticated as whatever, as the jazz musicians of the day. But that's ground zero for Afro-Cuban jazz. So it wasn't born in Cuba, and it wasn't born in Africa. It was born right here in New York City, just like doo-wop, just like Latin boogaloo, and just like hip-hop.
who's on the bass?
That's Julio Andino. No, I'm sorry, that's Bobby Rodriguez. Bobby Rodriguez. Yeah, that's Bobby Rodriguez.
Couldn't do it without the bass.
So, what I'll do now is give you a little taste of what the Machito Orchestra sounded like. This is with Mario Balza, his orchestra, and we recreated one of the pieces that Machito recorded on the Kenya album called Wild Jungle. So you're going to get to hear it now. But this was done around 1992. But listen to how advanced this music sounds. Recorded in 92, played in 1992, but it was really written in 1957. And that'll be our last thing.
Unfortunately.
Now, before we go, I'd like to thank somebody who really assisted me in this. And I couldn't have done this without her. And she's a cultural anthropologist and folklorist for City Lore in New York City, one of the incredible organizations that many of you don't know about, but you should go to their website, citylore.org. And many of you have that map that I gave you from Mambo to Hip Hop. And she was the one that put that map together and did all of the research. Miss Elena Martinez, right over here.
Yeah.
has always been an advocate of racial equality and believes that music is an international language that comes from the heart. This is reflected in the type of band he has today.
Higgis. Yeah, Henry Threadgill. That's Henry Threadgill. This gentleman was the original baritone player for the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Orchestra. And the guy next to him was Henry Threadgill, who's from the avant-garde jazz group. Is that Mario? No, that's Victor Paz. Mario's in front of the band.
Conrad?
Yeah. That's Stanton Davis. Stanton Davis. Yeah, from 1957. That's what I used to look like. That's Oscar Hernandez. How about it for Mr. Mario Balzan?
How about for Bobby Sanabria? I have two questions. I have two questions in conclusion this evening, and one is the obvious one. Did you have a good time?
Yes.
And my second question is, will you please come back and pick it up where you left off?
Sure.
Because I have to tell you something, I teach myself, and I have to tell you, I felt tonight like the luckiest student in the world. I mean, this man just talked for 90 minutes without a break, leading up to a historic recording, and I'm sitting here feeling like I could sit here for another hour, 2, 3, 4. I mean it. He's that just absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for everything you've done. We're going to present Bobby with our Jazz Museum in Harlem things.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm glad I dressed up.
Now, listen, before you leave, I just want to say a couple of things real quick. This series is going ahead, starting in January. Make sure you signed our mailing list for those that aren't on it, so we can send you the cards. You can come back and bring some more people. We've always got food and drink for everybody. And again, I just want to thank you all for coming, and have a happy Christmas and happy Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, and whatever you celebrate. Thank you so much.